One thing I've learned after nearly 30 years in property is that behind every property transaction, there's a story, a big decision, and often a lot more emotion and complexity than people expect. This podcast is all about giving you access to the people, insights, and strategies behind smart property decisions so you can make better moves, whether you're buying your first home, investing, selling, downsizing, or planning your next step.
Welcome back to the Melbourne Property Brief with Warwick Brookes. Today we're diving into the world of town planning and development, and more specifically, the major planning changes currently reshaping Victoria's property landscape. Because whether you're a homeowner, investor, developer, or someone simply considering your future options, understanding planning controls and what may or may not be possible on a property can have a huge impact on both the value and opportunity. I'm joined today by Laurie Rigoni from Terrain Consulting Group. Laurie has more than 35 years' experience in urban and statutory planning and has worked across residential, commercial and industrial development throughout Victoria. Through Terrain Consulting Group, Laurie and his team work closely with property owners, developers, architects, councils and investors to help navigate planning approvals, subdivisions, rezoning and development opportunities. With so many planning changes currently happening across Victoria, I thought this would be a really valuable conversation for anyone wanting to better understand where things are heading and how these changes may impact property owners moving forward. Laurie, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Warwick. Pleasure to be here.
So, Laurie, how did you first get into town planning and what drew you to the industry?
Well, I've always had an interest in geography and society and how those areas form our cities. So it was a logical career path to get into town planning.
So after more than 3 decades in the development industry, what do you still enjoy most about your work?
Well, town planning is a very multidisciplinary profession. Every day is unique. No day is the same, whether it's from the first phone call, the inquiry, there's always an interest there. And the way I see it is what we do in our profession, we can make a difference because it's looking at making our cities and our towns a really good place to live.
So for people who are listening, hearing the term town planner may not fully understand what that role involves. How would you explain what you actually do?
Yeah, town planning is one of the few professions that actually has a lens to the future. So we look at demographics, we look at population growth, we look at analyse the economy, mindful of the politics of the government, closely at legislation and policy and all those population trends, look at architecture, and that all forms in terms of what a town planner does. So it's quite multidisciplined. There's an old saying that a town planner knows a bit about everything.
So what are some of the misconceptions people have around town planning and development?
Probably the main misconceptions is that they're wary about when they hear the word town planning and they need to apply to council for town planning approval. The town planning system is very complex, but if you have the right team around you that can navigate through the planning policy and the provisions, then there's no reason why you can't get your project or development or whatever you're proposing through the system and approved.
So people often underestimate how much planning controls can impact the value or future potential of the property.
Yeah, absolutely. It's often what you don't know is what you should know. You know, it could be something as simple as people may have a parcel of land of a particular size that don't really realise its full potential because it may be in a growth area. Or they may have a large parcel of land but it's got a single dwelling covenant on the property which would limit development. Or more recently, with the changes that the Victorian state government's introduced, they have land, whether it's commercial or residential, whereby there's a rezoning either proposed or has undertaken that has a zoning uplift, so they can do much more on the property. So having an insight in terms of what you can do on the property currently, but also more importantly, what is a future plans, a really insightful piece of knowledge.
For people looking to buy a property, and they might be wanting to develop it, or they're buying a family home that they want to extend, how important is it that they speak to someone like yourself before they buy?
Well, from a pre-purchase advice, I give a lot of advice to buyers agents and vendors agents. The way I look at it is that if there's any query about the development side of what you do on a property from a town planning perspective, that's your insurance pre-purchase. You wouldn't drive a car without insurance, and it's the same thing, I think, as part of your due diligence. Why wouldn't you get, as part of the due diligence, some planning advice of what you can and can't do on the property? And that could be the difference of whether or not you purchase the property.
There's obviously an enormous change happening in Victoria in the planning system. What are some of the biggest reforms currently taking place?
I've often said when I do presentations that I've been doing this for 37 years, and this is the biggest changes across the Vic government in the last 30 years. So the emphasis the government now has is on a 70-30 split, 70% of housing, and they want in the established metropolitan area, 30% on the growth areas. What the government's also done is they've rolled out housing expectations right across the state, not just Melbourne metropolitan focused. So each council has higher housing targets that they're expected to achieve by 2050, and also regional Victoria, even the small towns around the state. The other major change that's occurred is the matter of focus on activity centres. We've got 60 activity centres that the government's rolled out, and in those areas there's a lot more multi-level apartments, mixed-use developments, and also development on the fringes that there's expected to change. So there's a lot of change that's in the wind.
So those new activity centres. So for somebody who owns a block of land that's now in that area, what does it mean for them?
You could have a property in the general residential zone. This is what's a typical zone in Victoria, or perhaps the neighbourhood residential zone. The general residential zone has a 3-storey height control, 11 metres. In those areas surrounding the activity centre, within about an 800 walking distance, those residential zones are earmarked to be rezoned or have been rezoned already to what's called housing choice transport zones. In the first 400 odd metres, they become housing choice transport zone 1. So what was a 3-storey height limit, perhaps 11 metres, flats, perhaps double-storey home, now could be anywhere between 4 to 6 stories if the land is large enough, and you're at about 1,000 square metres. If it's less, it's about 4. If you go a little bit further out, in the neighbourhood residential zones, which was only 2 stories, 9 metres height, same uplift. Their default height is now 3 stories, and if it's 1,000 square metres, 4 stories. So not just the activity centres, the core, but also the residential areas. The state government's identifying and has rezoned land to facilitate a lot more development. And this is right across metropolitan Melbourne.
So out of those kind of areas that you've seen, are there areas that are kind of taking off more than others?
Yeah, so in terms of strategically, they're mainly focused around the train stations, the rail corridors. There's a lot along the southeast rail corridors. There's less so in the northern parts of Metro Melbourne, but the corridors such as Heatherton, Oakley, Nunawading, Ringwood, Camberwell Junction, Kew Junction, even though it hasn't got rail, it's identified as one. There's just a few that comes to mind, but there's generally on the rail corridors, the southeast and the northern areas, they're the focal. The government does have maps on their website where you can find exactly where these corridors are located and where the zones apply, where you can focus on potential opportunities.
I find it interesting, you mentioned Kew. So there's a lot of development happening here. The Old Vic Road site, the Leo's supermarket is another big one that's happening. So they're pushing a lot of big developments into that location that already has traffic issues. Are they taking into account cars when they do these?
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. I mean, there was a change that happened on the 18th of December last year. Suffice to say, it was somewhat unexpected in the industry, whereby government legislated and changed the car parking provisions, which effectively, in many cases, halved the rate depending on where you're located. So in those activity centres close to the trains, really well serviced with public transport and amongst the commercial areas, it's not unusual that you would possibly find for apartments, for example, 0 car parking. The view is that you use the trains, you use the trams, you use the bus network more. And as you go further out, the rates would modify. But even then, for a townhouse development, pre-18th December, it was 2 spaces for a 3-bedroom townhouse, 1 space for a 1 and 2 bedroom. Now it's simply 1.2 spaces per dwelling, in some cases down to 1. So, and they've also removed the notion for visitor parking. So it is interesting, and the way the government's looking at is to promote development, to make it cost effective on the basis that it's walking distance to the public transport system. We don't have to provide as much parking.
It's going to be interesting in the inner city locations for the older houses that don't have parking already, where getting a park at night time can be a challenge. Once these get built, what the impact is going to be at
That's right.
that time.
Yeah, you're right, Warwick. And so I suppose the market will determine if you've got apartments in the inner city where parking on the street is competitive. But if none of those apartments have car parking, then it may well be that the purchaser of those apartments, a particular market, wouldn't have a vehicle. You'd rely on the public transport, bicycles, or perhaps the go-get share car scheme. So I think that's a philosophy and theory by the government. I understand that, but we'll see what occurs when they roll out.
Yeah, well, we all understand the government's theories and philosophies don't always align with real life. But yeah, I think it's going to definitely increase the value for houses with car parking because it's going to make them more and more in demand in those locations.
Well, that's right. And we're telling to our clients when the regulations came in the 8th of December, we put it to them that your project, whether they're warehousing, commercial or residential, the rates are now not as significant. But we put to them, whilst you could perhaps only one space per dwelling, you need to ask yourself, well, what's the market asking for? Well, and many of them are still providing more car parking than what the rates would indicate. But time will tell what the market would adjust to.
And I think with these new changes and people not knowing, most people won't know that these changes have happened. They won't know the potential of their land. And when they go to sell, most real estate agents actually don't understand it. And all they put on their advertising copy is STCA. And go and kind of, if you want to have a look at it, do you think for people wanting to sell, it's worthwhile kind of doing a bit of research so that they can actually say or know what their site is capable of and provide that to the real estate agent to say, look, you can do this with this site?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, we often speak to technically vendors agents, and we encourage real estate agents that if time allows and the vendor wants to get a premium price and petition for the property, there's no harm at all valuating to the property. So if it's a case that one can obtain a planning permit, 4 or 5 townhouses on a property, or just simply a dual occupancy, or valuate a property through an apartment project, then put it on the, well, you don't have to say STCA in the advertising board. You can say prime development site in the middle of an activity centre or a pristine street, or plans and permits approved for 4 dwellings or 5 dwellings. So, yeah, I often say think about valuating if the opportunity arises that we can assist with that process.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things is the whole how many can you put on a site? Because that's one of the most confusing, especially when we're looking at sites for clients. Kind of, and we use programs like Archistar. They're kind of a little bit hit and miss. But yeah, understanding, okay, what is the true potential of that site can make a big difference to the offer you make, and ultimately if that's going to be a profitable exercise for you.
That's correct, yeah. Yep. And it's what's knowing on the property. You need to look just beyond the size of the land and the width of the property. You need to look at the slope of the land. You need to study the title. Are there any easements? Are there any covenants? And particularly these days with legislation was introduced last October, the big governments increased the emphasis on tree canopy and vegetation.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. So we need to be mindful of that. So if you've got a large tree on your property, one can't assume that you can remove that tree. You should need to get it surveyed and get an arborist to have a look at it. The challenge is how can you do that before the purchase of the property?
Yes. Trees are the bane of my property searching existence. We always do an aerial look and then we do a street view, and sometimes we can't get a clear picture. So we drive out there and then we look at it and go, no, they're not going to get that through. So I think another big thing that's kind of happening is the government are trying to get things faster through the system because councils are notoriously slow. What changes are they kind of implementing there?
Years ago, if I look at private building surveying, for example, in the 90s, they privatised it. So you didn't have to go to a council building surveyor. You could go to a private building surveyor to get your building permits. Now, it's not at that position yet. But what the government has done is they've made the regulations, particularly from a housing perspective, a lot more prescriptive. What they've done is they've remove the notion of neighbourhood character. So a lot of the delays at councils used to be quite subjective. We want a setback here and a recess there and a colour of a wall there and a different type of material and etc. That's all removed now. So influence that council officers have on neighbourhood character by legislation is now removed. That's all being done to make a more efficient build. If you build ground floor, first floor on top of each other, it's more efficient than low-bearing beams with the recess. What they've also done is they've introduced the notion of deemed to comply provisions. What that means is if you design a development to particular provisions, in the case of 3 units plus, whilst you need a planning permit, when it's advertised, if there were objectors, the objectors can't take that further to the tribunal. In the case of 2 dwellings on a block, the VCAT provisions we introduced in August 25, that all means is that if you design the 2 dwellings or 2-lot subdivision to the deemed to comply provisions, the relative clause 55 for multi-units or clause 56 for subdivision, whilst you need a planning permit, it's actually exempt from public notification. There's no third-party involvement. And the provision therefore says that by legislation, regulations indicate the council should be issuing that 2 dwellings on the block under VCAT or 2-lot sub under 10 statutory days. So when I mention that, it surprises a lot of people. I've got an old saying, you can go to Europe and back, and by the time you get back, you could have your planning permit in your mailbox, so to speak. So that's unheard of. That was the last time there was something similar to that would have been in the early 80s where we had, as a right, dual occupancy where you didn't need a permit. They haven't gone that far. But the interesting thing is that, the 10 statutory days. So we're getting a lot of interest and a lot of activity for those type of projects through our consultancy at the moment because it gives people certainty.
When you mentioned they've taken away the character, do you think that is going to have a negative impact on, and the councils were strict to try and make it look, in their opinion, better for the area. Do you think relaxing those rules is going to be a negative for some developments from the perspective of surrounding people?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. When the provisions and removing neighbourhood character was first announced in March 25, the whole industry was asking that question. And I suppose time will tell. One would think if there's a developer or investor putting 2, 3 units or 10 or 20 on a block, they will design to what the market response would be. And it's fairly competitive out there. So one would think the architects in association with the developer would design something that they're proud of. That would be the expectations.
You would hope that's the expectation.
Yeah.
You go to certain locations around Melbourne and the townhouses all look the same.
Well, that's right. And look, and probably some of the smaller projects, perhaps not with the most skilled designer or perhaps the developer that is really
budget driven,
cutting courses. Yeah, budget conscious, feasibility. Yeah, corners will be cut. And look, there will be those circumstances, but I would hope, and you have to have faith in the market. The market will determine what actually works and what doesn't. Those mistakes wouldn't be repeated.
It will be interesting because now that there's forcing investors to just buy new builds, it will create a demand for the people building the lower quality investment stock. So they may not have to react to the market as much because they won't be selling to homeowners. They'll be selling to investors. But we'll see how that kind of pans out.
I've thought a lot about this for the last couple of weeks since the federal budget. And on one hand, I was thinking, if developers weren't building because of construction costs the week before the budget, why would they build now? But I've been thinking lately, perhaps the incentive of negative gearing with new dwellings, investors may then gravitate to that new stock.
Which is going to be significantly more expensive than it used to be. So I think it's going to have a negative impact of what the government's wanting to do. It's going to push the price of all new stock up, which is going to make it harder for people to get into housing.
Yeah, and the big unknown is what impact will have on the rental market, because if landlords are divesting because of land tax, and that's what's happening, and landlords aren't buying existing stock post federal budget because the negative gearing benefits aren't there, what does it then provide the opportunity for renters and supply? So it's a concern.
Inner city renters are going to be slugged with higher rent and more competition. So I'm going to jump onto clause 54 and 55 for a second. Can you explain the challenges around these clauses and why they're important?
Yes, so Clause 54, you'll hear them from town planners and architects and designers. 54 deals with single dwellings. 55 deals with multi-dwellings, they're two or more. Both clauses still have matters related to overlooking, overshadowing, setbacks, open space, etc. Hand in hand with that, a lot of those provisions have been tweaked and they're not as stringent. But the common thread between both of them is, as I mentioned previously, neighbourhood character has been removed. The only exception would be if you're in a heritage area. If you're in a heritage area, the barbell is still as high as it's always been, and there's a fine balancing act between achieving what you want to achieve for your first floor extension to accommodate the family, meeting the setback provisions and sight lines from a heritage perspective. But heritage matters aside, neighbourhood character in both instances is the major change. And as I mentioned previously, the deemed to comply provisions whereby third-party involvement is limited. They could still object, but they can't take the matter to VCAT, which therefore means that if they can't take it to VCAT, there's less appeals by objectors, and therefore there's more circumstances of a planning permit would be issued at council rather than a notice of decision and go through 9 to 12 months through the tribunal process. So definitely in my experience, our office and across the industry, the cases at VCAT has dropped significantly because of these provisions. And that's a good thing because that gives certainty for people developing sites. Objectors, it may not be a good thing because their involvement is less. So again, like you said before, Warwick, we'll see what happens once they're built in the next year or two to see what the outcomes come through.
Yeah, I just want to jump back to trees for a sec because, as I said, they're the bane of my life. So for somebody who owns a site that has the potential, that they're living in it, they're not planning on selling, but it does have the potential in the future to be something, and they have trees on their block that may not be at a size now that is a problem, but in 10, 15 years when they might want to sell it, they will become a problem. From your perspective, are they better just to get rid of them now?
Yes, if they can. And I say that because a lot of councils had already for many, many years vegetation controls. They're called vegetation protection overlay or significant landscape overlays. They tend to be those councils just on the fringe with a lot of vegetation, which makes part of their environment. That's why the people buy there. There are some councils, though, that didn't have any controls, that they introduced local tree laws. And it was their vast way of getting some control on trees on properties which weren't subject to town planning controls. And they generally related to the height of the tree and the width of the canopy. In those local tree law circumstances, unlike town planning applications where if you disagree with council, you can take it to the tribunal, contest it with arborist evidence. Tree laws, it's council's arborists, they assess it. If they're of the view that it should be kept, you can appeal internally back to council. Reassessment, if they say no, then that's really door shut. I think you could appeal to the Supreme Court as a means. So you need to be mindful of trees, what actually laws apply to the property. In October last year, there was a significant amendment, again, which caught the industry and the community by surprise, and that was introduced of 5237, canopy tree provisions. What that means is if you've got a large tree within the first 6 metres or rear 4.5 metres, and that tree 5 metres in height, 4 metres in width, and a diameter width at 1.4 metre in height, I think it's the order about 500 millimetres, that needs a planning permit. So when I tell people that if you own a property, you now have a tree control on your property. If you have a tree on the property, be mindful and go out and measure that tree. If it's 5 metres or higher or 4 metres wider, you need a planning permit. The legislation's worded in a way you can't even trim that branch down back to make it less than 4 metres. So that is one hand's given, one hand's taken. On one hand, the state government is decreasing the red tape to increase yield and opportunities for development. But on the other hand, they've introduced these vegetation tree controls, which is a barrier right from the outset.
Does that also apply to non-native trees?
Any tree. So if you've got a 5.2 metre lemon tree in your backyard, it picks it up. It doesn't distinguish. So then you've got to do the assessment, and then your council's arborist would consider, well, is that 5.2 metre lemon tree provide any arboricultural value. You normally think it wouldn't unless you were making a lot of lemon cakes. Yeah, so that is pre-purchase. That's the unknown. If you're lucky enough to get a long settlement, you can get a surveyor in there and do an assessment with an arborist within the 30-day campaign. That'll be ideal. Otherwise, you need to do as best as you can to make a call on them.
So you've represented clients through VCAT and planning disputes for a lot of years. What are some of the biggest reasons projects run into trouble?
It's when we engage at the 11th hour. The architects, designers run it through the system without a planning consultant. They've got a bucket load of objectives. It's going to a council meeting. By the time that occurs, it's probably a bit hard to retrieve and put it back on deck. Or we will get engaged after council has refused an application. So then going to VCAT, it's putting it back. We might need to revise plans. We make amendments through the tribunal process. Invariably, there'll be costs associated with that, calling evidence, whether they're traffic engineers or arboriculturists or heritage architects, and go through the tribunal process. So the message we give when we run applications through Terrain Consulting Group, there's very few matters that go to the tribunal because we're involved at the early stages. We really work the process. We work with the council officers. We'll come within compromises but still meet in the client's brief. Our work at the tribunal tends to be if we're not involved in that process. So I think the message is get your town planning consultant involved as early as possible with the planning application.
And so obviously you deal with a lot of this and architects and builders. Do you have contacts that you know are reliable and quality?
Yeah, look, we do work for probably about 40-odd architects across the metro area, architects and designers. If someone approaches and they don't have an architect designer, we can match them with someone that would suit their personality type and also their type of proposal. We have architects that bespoke residential additions, those that do commercial development and those that do townhouses. Also, we've got a very wide network of sub-consultants, as I mentioned, heritage, arborists, landscape architects, traffic engineers, environmental sustainability consultants, lighting consultants. All consultants are coming to the pitch depending on the proposal. Yeah, so people we've worked with, people that are renowned and reputable within the industry.
Yeah, I think there's going to be, with the whole negative gearing, I think there's going to be a lot of people who are going to start going down that path of buying an existing house and straight away getting plans and permits for side-by-side dual lock and building where they might have land banked it for quite a few years. I think this is going to now just push a lot of those people to go, okay, well, I want to keep the negative gearing. I want to have all those benefits. I just have to get through that project now. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that kind of, because we've had a few of our clients already pivot to us to say, because we were essentially looking at good sites to land bank, and now they're saying, okay, well, if we can't land bank, let's look at something that the house is ready to go now, and we'll just do it straight away.
And look, and that's the objective from a national perspective. What the federal budget from last week is all about: increase housing supply and providing the opportunity to people buy into the market. So if you've got one house on a property, 2 or 3 or 4, there's a net increase, and rewarding those homes that can still negative gear.
Yeah, well, I think the interesting factor will also be, I'm not sure if a lot of these guys are going to be selling them, because negative gearing is going to be the ability to have it is going to be so powerful. And if you can keep it in a good location and not be pushed to the outer suburbs to have to get it, they might just rent them out long term.
Could be. Yeah, that's a good point, which therefore means that if it doesn't go on the market, those first home owners or those upsizers or downsizers may not have the opportunity. Look, it's what I've learned over the years, that the planning is very apolitical, and when the government introduces new legislation, or in this case taxes, we really won't know the outcome until years down the track. So, look, it's good there's been debate going on, but we'll just have to wait and see what it all means.
So to looking ahead, what do you think Melbourne's property landscape is going to look like in the next 10 to 15 years if what they're wanting to do and these planning reforms continue?
It's going to be a lot taller, Warwick. It's going to be a lot denser. There'll be more modern buildings, more innovation, because character's being removed. As you touched on before, I think there's going to be more traffic and parking. Unless everyone moves away from the use of vehicles, but that's all dependent on the public transport system, of course. Our cities will be more dynamic because with this increased population, there's increased activity. So it'll be interesting how that, I'm hoping will have a positive impact from a commercial sense, from an economic perspective. I do wonder, though, what impact it will have on the rental market, whether the rental market, they'll just simply be priced out of the market because construction costs are quite high. So I think there needs to be some tweaks definitely by the government at state level and federal level to address all the taxes, fees and charges, to address construction costs, give opportunities for apprentices to get into the system, give some incentives for developers to build on properties. And a developer can be someone that just does one house in the backyard. It's not the stereotype multi-level apartment. And also the banking sector. I'm speaking to a lot of bankers. I had a meeting with a banker from a Big Four yesterday, and they're just risk averse to lending to anything other than extending your home and buying your home. So the banks need to come into the party as well to lower the interest cost and lessen the barbell for the funding arrangements. So a lot of things have to happen. I think that needs a drive, firstly federally, but also a state government as well.
So kind of to finish up, if somebody owns a property and has never looked into the planning potential of their site or even they're looking to buy one, what's the first thing you encourage them to do?
Speak to professionals, speak to trusted buyers agents, vendors agents that have a lateral strategic view about the property market. Engage with town planners. All means call council and have a discussion and speak to them about what does this so mean, what this policy means, but also supplement that with speaking to a consultant. A consultant would give some lateral strategic thinking as well. Yeah, and just be mindful that what you see isn't necessarily what the obvious situation is. And as I said before, look at the cities in a future lens because there's a lot of change occurring. I mentioned a number of my seminars in my 37 years doing this profession. It's the biggest changes I've seen in 30 years. And the other observation is for the first time in those 30 years, the property owner, has the power, so to speak. Whereas until March last year, it was the council and the objectors told you what to do on the property. They still have their say, but the influence is very much lessened. So if people are wary about buying land to develop, you don't have to be. There's some real opportunities out there, and there's more and more opportunities that will come about as well.
I think what's really clear from today's conversation is just how much change is happening in the planning space right now and how significantly it could shape the future of Melbourne property. Whether someone is buying, developing, investing, or simply wanting to understand what may happen around them in the years ahead, planning is becoming an increasingly important part of the property conversation. We've also put together a simple town planning and development potential checklist to help buyers and owners better understand what they should investigate before making property decisions. We'll throw that in the link below. Laurie, really appreciate you sharing your experience and helping break down what can sometimes feel like a very complex topic. Thanks for listening to the Melbourne Property Brief, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode.